Hi, and welcome to our lecture titled Moving Research to Practice, Lessons Learned and Applied for Building Equitable and Trusting Family Professional Partnerships. My name is Dr. Tracy Gershwin. I'm a professor of special education and I'm a board certified behavior analyst. And so I'm really looking forward to presenting this incredibly important topic to you today. We have three major objectives that we'll be covering today. The first is I will define equitable and trusting family professional partnerships. Next, I will review research about barriers to developing trusting family professional partnerships. And finally, I will identify strategies that can be used to address barriers to developing those trusting family professional partnerships. Before we begin, there's two major things I'd like to share. When we talk about the family professional partnership, students should always be considered to be the first and most important member of the IEP team and member of this partnership. So although you'll hear me say families and professionals a great deal more than you'll hear me say students today, the students should always be considered as the most important member. But the focus for today is on how families and professionals can work together to develop that trusting partnership. And also I'll be using families and parents and teacher, educator, and professional interchangeably. So I want to recognize all of the diverse families that we see in our schools and all of the different ways that families may be made up, and as well as all the different educators and professionals that interact with our students in our schools, that there's no one family, no one parent, and no one teacher, educator, or professional that can be sort of described as everybody. We're all unique individuals, and so I will be using those terms interchangeably. And let's get started. So trusting family professional partnerships are characterized by an alliance in which families and professionals confidently build in each other's word, judgment, and wise actions to increase educational benefits for students and themselves. This is a definition that comes out of a Turnbull text developed specifically for teachers and family members to learn how to work together to build a trusting family professional partnership. And one thing that I really like to acknowledge when it comes to trust and why we're talking about trust is that trust is something that is often taken for granted and easily expected between families and educators. So the great philosopher Bayer said, "We notice trust as we notice air, only when it becomes scarce or polluted." There is a great amount of trust that is required to exist between families and educators and students to be able to work together in the way that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act intended. And so what that means is oftentimes, unfortunately, there is this level of expectation that trust will naturally develop between educators and professionals, but that doesn't always exist. And we tend to not notice it or reinforce it when it is happening. And instead, we tend to acknowledge it when it's not happening. So as a behavior analyst, I like to bring this up because it's important that when we know we have a trusting and meaningful relationship, we should celebrate it. We should reinforce it. We should share with the other members of our team how we feel trusted, how we feel that we can trust them, etc., so that hopefully we can nurture that trusting relationship rather than demand it or expect it in the way that we see, unfortunately, too many times in our schools. So as you learn today about trust, please keep in mind the notion of building, nurturing, and repairing trust, and that it is a life cycle. And so much like conflict prevention and resolution, when it takes place, trust requires vulnerability and effort. And so if we are developing trust with another member of an educational team, we need to be vulnerable and understanding of that vulnerability. Trust between professionals and families, this has come up repeatedly in research as an essential component for the development and maintenance of the family professional partnership. I do a lot of research that focuses on conflict prevention and resolution between families and professionals. And the number one word that comes up regularly is trust, that there's a lack of trust when conflict develops or that there is trust when there's a meaningful partnership. We also know that trust can escalate or de-escalate conflict. So if I know that I trust my child's educator, I might be more flexible or more understanding if they recommend, for example, an intervention that I might not otherwise agree to be something that would be appropriate for my child. But if I have that trust there, I'm more likely to listen to the educator, to understand their input, to hear from them before dismissing an idea that might otherwise be a really good idea for my student or my child. And so the reason why this presentation is taking place is because we know that trust is necessary to have a meaningful family professional partnership. And we know that trust takes time to develop. And we also know that trust can break in a matter of seconds, and that can take a really long time to build back up. So because trust is an integral component to the family professional partnership, we will be talking about very specific trustworthy actions that you can exhibit to build that between families and educators. So it's really important that we acknowledge parent experiences with family professional interactions, and many of those are not positive, and they all point to how trust can be broken. So we know that family professionals have shared experiences with an unequal or a power imbalance. They've shared that special education system is daunting, that they're overwhelmed with jargon and language that is often used when they interact with professionals, that a lot of the interactions might be heavy on paperwork, not just IEP paperwork, but maybe long emails, etc. That they're more formal interactions that mostly take place, which changes the level of comfort between a family member and a professional. And then finally, in a study that I conducted with fathers of children with disabilities, they all use the terminology, a metaphor, to describe themselves as feeling like the quote odd man out, where we know that there is an unequal level of interactions between family members that's noted in our research, where most educators are known to talk directly to mothers only, if the mother and the father, if those are the two gender roles that are at the meeting. If the mother and the father parent roles are there, then we see family members point out that mostly the mother is being talked to, including fathers who shared that they are the primary provider for their child. And when the mother was present, the team still talked directly to the mother. So we know that there are some challenges with family professional interactions. And one of those is making sure that we're not leaving out certain family members who may be present when we're having our interactions. So the research that exists about barriers to developing, nurturing, trusting partnerships with families is that many families will have a negative history, sometimes with schools, sometimes with other educators, sometimes with professionals that they've interacted with in the past for their child. We know that there is an inequity that takes place in this interaction because there's a natural inequity in that a school district and professionals naturally hold a great amount of knowledge, information, skills, and access to educational records, et cetera, that family members otherwise don't have. There's an already broken down inequity that's built in, as well as several other inequities that take place in other areas, which I'll talk about next. We've got cultural and linguistic barriers that exist. There could be inaccurate or false knowledge or information that is shared between professionals and family members that might create a barrier to that trusting partnership. There could be a significant difference in the values or attitudes that could create mistrust. Could be incompatible goals or expectations. There could be systemic or procedural obstacles. And then there's environmental and economic barriers that may get in the way of developing that trusting partnership. So it could be something like many families might have more access if they can come to the school and volunteer regularly. And if they're not able to do that, then there's there's a disconnect between the family and professional partnership. These are barriers that can create discord between the families and educators and mistrust. And, ultimately, to those challenges, really want to emphasize that trust needs to be built and it takes time, but that any of those challenges could happen in a moment's notice and immediately can relate to mistrust between families and educators. So there's strategies that we can use to address these barriers to trusting family professional partnerships. So now let's talk about how can we move our research to practice. So we know that educators and families are challenged with developing those trusting partnerships. So what kinds of things can we do to help them develop trust? The first is, we know that when there's mutual trust, that there's a meaningful partnership. When there's equity, when there's mutual goals, shared decision-making, there's trust in awareness of each member's perspectives. There's trust when somebody else is able to provide that they understand my perspective. There's ongoing communication, and a student-centered approach builds trust. So now let's look at trust in a more observable and measurable way. I like to break things down in observable and measurable behavior so educators know the best ways to act so that we can meaningfully involve families and build trust and nurture that trust throughout our interactions with them. And so one of those ways to really break down trust is the definition that comes from educational literature of trust. There's several different definitions, but Shannon Moran, this is a trust definition that I will be utilizing, is a willingness to be vulnerable to another party based on the confidence that the latter party is benevolent, reliable, competent, open, and honest. And so that means we want to make sure that we are approaching all of our relationships, families and educators, alike. So it's not just educators who are benevolent and reliable and competent and honest and open, but it's also family members who need to be benevolent and reliable and open and competent and honest to build that trust with families. But really emphasizing there's a level of vulnerability that takes place between families and educators when we seek to build that trust with each other. So talking about solutions that move from research to practice, we look at the sunshine model of trusting family professional partnerships as a potential way to frame different ways that we can create those partnerships. So this trusting partnership model, if you'll notice, has trust in the middle. And so that's the core of the partnership. And there's 5 specific areas that are described in the next sections that are respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment. And these are professional behaviors that have been identified in the research as those that seek to build and maintain trust with families through a variety of activities. So the rays of our sunshine represent the different activities that families and professionals may interact with one another to build and maintain that trust. So family members and professionals work toward academic learning of the student, the social emotional learning for the student, the behavior, the student assessment, special meetings such as IEPs, 504s, parent-teacher conferences, student transitions that might include all different ages and stages. So moving from the IFSP to the IEP, transitioning from maybe middle to high school or elementary to middle school, and then finally even those post-secondary transitions or any other transitions. There might even be student transitions that are going on in the family's life that the families and professionals need to work together to provide support for that student. And then finally, school capacity enhancement, when educators and families are working together to enhance or improve the educational system. So this is a model that we use as a way to bridge that research and practice knowing what challenges families experience with developing nurturing and trusting relationships, and how we can instead provide strategies to counterbalance some of those challenges or barriers that families experience and professionals experience to developing these partnerships. The first is respect. So respect practices benevolence through due regard for the feelings, wishes, rights, and traditions of others. So there are several various strategies here that are listed that demonstrate respect for families. So that could be first, developing relationships with families. Next, communicating with families on an ongoing basis, treating families with esteem and adhering to boundaries, balancing power dynamics, looking at those numbers of educators to family members and realizing that when you have a large group of educators and maybe one or two family members present, that there are a lot of power dynamics that might need to be balanced a little bit. So maybe if you can meet alone with the family member, if you don't need to have 5 educators present, then maybe you should do that to balance that, and some other things you can do. Being empathetic, and there's a difference between being empathetic and sympathetic. So looking into understanding those differences, honoring family culture and reflecting on your own cultural lens when you work with families, knowing what biases you may bring to the table, celebrating student and family strengths, seeking to understand family values, being open-minded, acknowledging each other's expertise. It's really important that during, and I've had a lot of family members say that it was very meaningful to them that during IEP meetings, somebody shared with them that they were the expert of their child. And that was an immediate sense of validation for that parent's membership of the IEP meeting, as well as participation in the child's education. Being acknowledged for the expertise that we hold for our children is incredibly important, and it's a really meaningful way to value the family members that are present. Being prepared to meet with the family at all different times, in person, different ways that need to be met, but be prepared to meet with the family when needed. And finally, attend meetings with families on time. This may sound like a no-brainer type of rule, but there's been many instances where families have shared with me educators showing up late, excuse me, which shows a complete disregard for the family who may have moved their work schedule, their babysitting schedule, their life schedule, and made all sorts of accommodations to be there for the meeting, and then to have an educator show up late. That demonstrates a lack of respect for that family member's time. These are only a few of many different ways that we can practice benevolence and respect for our families. The next is equity, and that is enhancing the fairness, equality of opportunity, and the dignity of our families. So it's incredibly important that we acknowledge and understand the power imbalances and the challenges that take place in our special education system. We have a conflict power imbalance. We have an uneven playing field. We have inequities with language and jargon that I've already acknowledged. So instead, let's talk about how can we prepare our family members to have more equitable opportunities. One of the ways we can do that is to provide them with different types of capital to help learn to understand the system. So social capital, social support would be having families partnered with each other to provide those parent-to-parent connections. An example is a study I did with a Latina mother group where they all were together, learning together, and they had a great amount of information they gained from having the social support with one another, as well as learning from another, as well as just information, and even their children to play with one another. So sometimes having opportunities for families to experience equity in our system would be to have them partnered with other families to have information and support. Familial capital is also supportive for equity, and that might be having family, extended family, or other families who can attend the meeting and provide support. We know that sometimes family members might have different levels of support. We have all different types of families that are representative at our IEP meetings. We might have teenage parents who need extra support to learn more because of some of the challenges they have with navigating the system. We also know that linguistic support can be helpful, providing language and special education language that can be informative and helpful for families. They have the linguistic capital so that they're able to participate in a meaningful way. And then there's some ways that resistance capital can be informative and helpful for families to access equity. And that might mean things like parent groups or activism and advocacy. And then finally, it's really important that we not forget about aspirational capital, which is we don't want to ever assume negative outcomes for a child or a parent. And oftentimes when we have conflict develop between families and educators and trust is broken is when there's discrepant language or views that's been used for that child and that parental expectations have been judged. And so we want to maintain the dignity and equality of opportunity for families and not negate any of their aspirational beliefs and acknowledge every family member as their own unique set to be available to support that student. Next, we have communication. And next to the word trust coming up, trust comes up repeatedly when conflict is, as I said, in research about family professional partnerships, trust comes up repeatedly. The second word that comes up the most is communication. And that is, it's an incredibly important component for that family professional partnership to develop, and emphasis on nurture. It's not just developing trust. We have to nurture that as well and maintain that trust, because again, trust can be broken in a moment's notice. And so the greater the trust, the more likely we are to be able to work through some of those challenges. And we develop trust through communication. So open communication. It's important that we're honest and open, that we're frequent and regular, that we're culturally responsive, and that we're empathetic with our families. It's important that we listen and that we're present when we're communicating and that we're mindful of what's happening. And we should also be very aware of nonverbal communication as well as the verbal communications that we experience. So we might look at some of those verbal or nonverbal cues while we're interacting with families and pay attention to them so we can see maybe where they're at. A lot of times we might just be talking to a parent rather than with a parent. So we want to make sure that communication is dual and that it's with, not to the families. So we want to make sure we have that moving forward with all interactions with families. And it's really important that when we meet a new family that we're working with, that at the very beginning, we establish and identify our communication system. How are we going to communicate regularly? And how are we going to communicate if or when a problem occurs? So if I have a disagreement about something, or if I'm concerned about a student issue, what's the best, most meaningful way for this educator and family member to come together and provide that information? Having that agreed upon prior to any challenging issues is all the difference in the world of maintaining trust and building trust. So we want to always have these conversations before we have challenges, not after we've had a challenge. So open lines of communication. Advocacy is an incredibly important component that's in our partnership model, our framework. We want to build trust through that type of advocacy. So that could be proactive, meaning we might be advocating for a service or an intervention for the student, or it might be a reactive thing where we're advocating for something that went wrong, that shouldn't have happened, that we want to do differently. I have my own personal story as an educator who was an advocate. That family member, it was actually the sole reason how I was able to build trust with a family member is that early in my teaching career, I had a group of students that I was teaching with, and believe it or not, I did not have any textbooks for my children. I didn't have, going back to that lack of equity, I had a challenge with services and resources for my students as an educator. And I actively advocated along with family members in my class for our students to receive the type of educational resources and books that they needed to move forward with their learning. And so by doing that, the families that were served in my class and the families of the children that I worked with, they saw the advocate in me who was willing to go above and beyond to support their children and the students in the classroom as well as their role. And so it's really important that we are advocates for our students, and we demonstrate that with our families as well. There are some barriers to parent advocacy that exist. Family members are sometimes scared of conflict. They might be scared that their child's going to be denied resources or mistreatment if they do speak out. There might be language issues or limited knowledge or power imbalance that challenges their advocacy. So having an educator who's available to also advocate along with the family members does make a big difference. How can we overcome some of those advocacy challenges? It's important that we make database decisions, that we document and use all legal guidelines and rights, and that we always reach and we always access research, evidence-based practices through what we're doing in our rationale for some of our advocacy efforts. Next, we have commitment in our Sunshine model for a professional behavior that promotes trust between families and professionals. And that is a professional who is able to remain active, willing, interested, flexible, and accessible to the family members. So we want families say that they want to be treated as more than a family or more than a student or a case. And so commitment is when an educator shows that it's more than a job, that they go above and beyond to resolve issues that may be concerning, such as the example of the textbooks I gave previously. Showing levels of commitment to the student are incredibly important. There's 4 types of indicators of commitment that we see in our research about the workplace as professionals can demonstrate. The 4 indicators of commitment are: 1 is your volition, that's your conscious choice to work there. The 2nd is bonding, forming connections with people, tasks, and activities. The 3rd is a dedication. It's showing strong support for the work that you do. And finally, responsibility is holding oneself accountable for the behavior that they exhibit in their job. So those are some really important ways that you can demonstrate commitment in to families that help to build that trusting partnership. And I'd like to end with this quote that trust is a human virtue that is cultivated through speech, conversations, commitments, and action. It is always a matter of human effort. It can and often must be conscientiously created, not simply taken for granted. So going back to what I shared at the very beginning is that we have the need for meaningful, trusting family professional partnerships. It's what was written into the law. It's been intended. It's also been repeatedly acknowledged in research that when family members and professionals work together, trust one another, that outcomes for students are always favorable. And so the more we acknowledge that trust has to and must be built and maintained actively through our actions and non-actions as professionals, then the more likely we are to be able to develop that trust. So we need to continue to make those actionable actions and not simply take them for granted or realize when trust is gone, because once it is gone, it is really hard to get back. But let's remember that trust can be a cycle. And so if you find that trust has been broken between a family and professionals, I encourage you to review these practices and see the ways that were challenged, how that trust was broken, and what strategies and practice can be used to bridge and rebuild that trust, because it can be rebuilt. But again, it will take time, and it is always a matter of human effort. And that is the end of this module. Thank you for your time.